Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our masterclass, Global Lessons, Local Impact, Strengthening Biosecurity and Food Safety in Australia's Poultry Sector with Egg Farmers Australia CEO and Churchill Fellow Melinda Hashimoto, presented as part of the Queensland Farmers Federation Farm Business Resilience Program. Today's webinar is jointly funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund and the Queensland Government's Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. Along with Melinda, we're also joined by Candice Stour from Queensland United Egg Producers, and as climate and market disruptions impact heavily, our collective representation is more important than ever. So if you want to know more about how QUEP and EFA are working in the interest of the egg industry, feel free to reach out to Candice or Melinda after this. My name's Beck Carl, and I'm the Project Officer delivering the Farm Business Resilience Program. We want today to be as interactive as possible, so please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you might have. And if you've got a follow-up question, feel free to unmute yourself. We do ask that you just mute your microphone while Melinda's speaking, as it just helps to limit background noise. Today's session will be recorded and the slides will be circulated after the session. We're really excited to have with us today Egg Farmers Australia CEO Melinda Hashimoto. Having grown up in a family business with a background in trade, agriculture, education and politics, and a strong work ethic has always been of importance to Melinda. Rural industries and trade opportunities for these industries are important to her as they're the growth of industry, local businesses, families, and our nation. With over 10 years government experience in a state trade department and as advisor for the Japanese government and senior advisor to state and federal ministers here at home, and her work across the poultry, pork, bovine genetics, horticulture, kangaroos, sugar, and emerging industries, Melinda continues to use her broad range of skills to add value to each industry she represents. Melinda has received a Churchill Fellowship in 2025, focused on the management of H5 avian influenza in Japan, and that's what she's going to tell us a bit more about today. We're so excited to have you with us, Melinda, and excited to hear more about your findings.
Thank you very much, Beck. Look, I'd like to thank everyone that's made this session possible, particularly QFF and QUEP. I guess the question was put to me, what can Australian agriculture learn from the world? And a key part of that is really connections. I think looking at the issue of avian influenza, we've seen that different countries have different styles, and certainly our government's worked very closely to look at what's happening in places like the US. They've now got models where quite often, rather than government coming in and doing some of the disposal and the cleanup, essentially funding is provided to the farmer. And they do that work, and then the government comes back and checks that it meets criteria. In the UK, they've had impacts where farmers have been really crippled by HPAI and then have needed supermarkets to come in and actually provide some support and some funding to help them get back on their feet. I think, many people will say, well, look, why Japan? Why is that the country that I focused on? And the reasoning was that they've had HPAI, the H5N1 strain, numerous times. And of course, that's the strain that can move to humans. They've not lost a person. And I was keen to understand what really has been the situation from when they first had H5 to, really the current situation now. They're having many outbreaks, and what's really not only the way that farmers are dealing with this, but also, the community and in communication as well. I think with doing this work, I felt, bringing the information back to Australia, there would be people definitely from poultry sector and government, looking at what were the findings, but I really was not expecting how far afield some of the information would go. And I had an Indian egg farmer that actually contacted me and had read my report and gave me an overview of his thoughts, which I was really thrilled that someone had taken the time to look at that. And it allowed me to then reach out to him and try and find out a little bit more about what they're doing over in India. So I think that, I was quite aware in India that the government do pay and support their farmers if they have avian influenza. But as far as getting, further detail, that's something that I'm working on to try and make those linkages. So you just never know, what great new information we can bring from other places and who might be looking at, how they can improve things in their country too by understanding what we're doing. Here in Australia, governments are really looking at industry taking on a greater role, and some companies believe that they can move more quickly. But I think for small companies, they'll definitely need government support. And I think, we're very conscious of the fact that although in Queensland we have a lot of capacity on farms to help in a disease response, we also have limited contractors across the nation. And so, I'm aware that New Zealand's got kind of a format for where they're showing where their contractors are, which is something that I'd really like to have here in Australia. And also, at a local level, I attended a biosecurity workshop run by Biosecurity Queensland a week ago, and that was a really great opportunity to just see how councils and disaster management groups are looking at what resources and equipment they have available to them to feed in and to help the state government. So my areas of research focus were really looking at that government, industry and academia link in, disposal, regulation, communication, and also, what's happening in Japan around vaccines. I think, the risk for our industries around finance and animal welfare, biosecurity, food safety, and also the pull on our resourcing is really important. But there's also a piece really around education and making the general public and community understand what does H5N1 mean, and how could it impact them, and how could it impact the products and our food security. So look, the Winston Churchill Fellows are a great program. Winston Churchill had said that he didn't want a whole heap of statues around it. And although we do find that there are statues of him, he really had the attitude that, an individual can make a difference. And the aim of the fellowships is to learn globally and inspire locally by bringing that information back. So if you've got someone the fellowships are open to any age group and topic, and it's really, I think, a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I'd encourage people to apply, and they've just opened their rounds for 2026. So this is a little clip that was taken locally before I left, and I think it's important to just, again, have that awareness of work that's being done. So I'll just play that.
Preparation against the deadly strain of bird flu is now underway in Australia. A Rockhampton egg expert is heading abroad looking for the best ways to minimise risk to the sector.
Australia is still yet to come in contact with the H5 strain of bird flu, but experts aren't being complacent.
Certainly, if we had H5, it would really be catastrophic for our egg industry.
Melinda has been following the trajectory of the harmful strain as it spreads across the globe over the last 5 years. Now she's headed to Japan to see how outbreaks are controlled and to share those insights back home.
It's all about learning globally and then inspiring locally. So my aim is to be able to bring back some of the gems that I learn, and hopefully that will help not only our own egg industry, but also keeping Australians safe.
The H5 strain is potentially deadly in humans too, making biosecurity a top priority.
If we get an exotic disease, the first thing that would happen would be that trading partners would stop buying our products, not to mention the impact on individual farms and producers if we did have one of those diseases here.
Melinda is confident her travels could curb some of that risk in the future.
To meet with other egg farms and to actually meet with the stakeholders around biosecurity and food safety, I certainly just feel very well placed to be able to try and help and bring that knowledge back to Australia.
Tieran Zylstra, Win News.
So look, whether you're farmer, vet, researcher, nutritionist, in the environment or wild bird area, animal welfare or food safety areas, I hope that there's something in my report for you, which can be found on the Churchill Trust website. So a comparison is that, Australia has around 20 million hens and Japan has 140 million hens. So it gives you some idea of just the volume of hens to feed their nation. And I met one farmer that had more hens than one whole state that we have here in Australia. So it just gives you some idea of just how large and how broad and how they're working in tackling the situation. We are aware that H5 can move to humans, and before I had left, we hadn't had any kind of confirmation, but of course we have had heard Island in the Antarctic, where it's a Australian area, but we haven't had it on the mainland. When I was in Japan, there was 11 confirmed HPAI outbreaks of H5 strain, and more were then found after I had left during my stay, with the latest that was confirmed while I was there was the 29th of December. So I think, it's something whereby we have had a number of outbreaks in multiple states, but we've had nothing like the numbers that they've had overseas. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the recommendations. I'll put the recommendations up, but I really just wanted to talk through really some of the themes of those recommendations. Firstly, shared responsibility. So I really found that when I was in Japan, there was very much an onus on, if you owned birds, whether they be pet birds or whether you're, in the industry producing as a commercial player, that there was a real responsibility on you seeking out the information in relation to biosecurity. So I really found that this was an area I thought, certainly for governments here to have that greater onus. We do now have the Poultry Post. So if people are not aware of Poultry Post, it was basically came out of an idea from our Egg Farmers of Australia board to have something like a national register. Now, because of the privacy situation, it wasn't possible to have something that worked across all of the states, but certainly the Poultry Post allows for an opt-in people to register, and they will be able to receive information through that avenue. I think that's a really positive move, and certainly in the ACT, when they had outbreaks of avian influenza, they had people from particular postcodes that were nearby who were asked to opt in, and it was very successful. So if you're not on Poultry Post already, I encourage you to please sign up. So certainly the other thing was really around industry communication. We as an organisation always try and send out information during responses. And I found that in Japan, certainly the information provided by the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry over there was available online. You can go to their website and you can see all of the outbreaks and where they have been, and it's in a very timely manner. So I think, continuing industry communication is important, but also that government onus has been very useful in Japan. Transparency when there is outbreaks. I think people need to understand in the general public what the strain means, and this was done in a face-to-face way in Japan. So they actually had a team of people that would go and sit down in the community where there was a farm that was impacted and talk about what that meant. I think in Australia, we have, I guess, less of that face-to-face, but certainly there's an opportunity for webinars to be done. And at times there's been clunky communication between states and councils. So there's certainly an area, I think, that we can learn from Japan in the way that they approach that. Farm level biosecurity, of course, it's important to have a biosecurity plan, and that's something that Queensland's very strong on. Other states don't have the same kind of biosecurity hub that we have in Queensland, so we're quite lucky in that way. And that people have actually looked at where they would manage the disposal of their birds. I think if we're talking about H5, certainly if you've got groups of people in a particular area, they may be able to look at the disposal together. But one of the really practical steps that I found that is really suitable for small producers, for larger producers to think about from the point of view of like filters, and also certainly for those, I've been to a number of rearing sheds that have the curtain roll-up kind of curtains, was to use non-woven fabric as a barrier to help with the airborne spread. And that was something, that Japan really knew about long before I believe we did here in Australia around the movement of HPAI through the air. So the farm that I visited, Mr. Akagi from Fusion Eggs, he had these simple basically welded frames, and he would put the non-woven fabric, which is the fabric that we all had in COVID on our masks during that particular time. We were all wearing it, and he has these simple frames that are wrapped in this fabric and are hung during the most kind of dangerous season. And since he's done that, he hasn't had any outbreaks of H5. He did have H5 at his farm previously, but this, using this kind of very simple metal frame, and it's not cost prohibitive, I think is a really good idea and something that should be looked at, as well as looking at using this material through filters. Food safety is very important in the way that Japan undertakes its food safety in a proactive and forward-facing approach. I do mention wild birds in my report, and more information around the work that's being done there in their surveillance. But even things like in one of the areas I was, which was a cormorant fishing area, they're actually taking the cormorants and vaccinating them, which is, rather dangerous job on the top of a cliff to get cormorants and basically vaccinate them. But this is the level that they're going to, and it just reminded me of the work, certainly in our wild bird space as well. So here in Australia, we need faster H5 testing. We can look at the ways that elevating food safety supervisors can be done. Recognition that some consumers purchase raw eggs, and messaging has to adapt to that over time. More value add products. So this really helps with easing staff pressures. That was another area that I found in Japan where there's been a lot of work done on value add egg products. And, clearer protocols around drone usage. So there's just been a new document that's been released in relation to drone usage. And that's something that we've been speaking with CASA about. In a previous incident, there was a farm whereby drone footage was taken with that farm name on it. And of course, permission was not given for that to be used, and it was provided to a broadcaster. So we've really tried as an industry body to be working on some of these issues coming forward. And of course, continuing to collaborate between Australia and Japan on technology as it evolves. So at the moment, there's a H5 testing that can, return a result in about 90 minutes. It's only research use at the moment. It's being used in wild birds, but we're keeping in touch on that because that's something that in the future may be able to be used for our industry once the verification has been done around that. So look, here's some pictures. This is when I visited the actual Japan, one of their co-ops, and they had this, machine out the front showing egg products, all of their brochures, and on the side you can just see the volume of egg products that are available also in the convenience stores. In Japan, people eat 330 eggs per capita yearly. We're at about 267. Yeah, that's gone up and down a little bit in the recent year. But I think certainly it gives us an idea of just the availability of eggs. Apologies, I have my phone on silent, so I'm not sure where that's coming through. This particular chart was viewable at the co-op, at one of the other research bodies I went to, and it was also available online, but it actually looks at the pricing of eggs across Japan, by month, and you can also see it by day as well. So this is something that we certainly can't do in Australia based on ACCC laws, but it's certainly something that's quite interesting in just the support that Japanese producers have in understanding, when there is a shortage of eggs due to HPAI, the government steps in and actually helps to kind of secure a price or put in a floor to assist. So this is just a little bit more around the way that they work the actual pricing, and it's certainly between government and industry. The industry also has a program. It's like a mutual fund where you can pay into it so that if you're affected by AI, you can also get some support as well. So they have a range of supports available to their producers. Another couple of egg ones for you, just to have a look at some of the products on shelf. This one here, you might be surprised that actually eggs are sold in 4-packs. A standard dozen here is actually 10 in Japan, so you buy eggs in basically like your cartons of 10. And this one up the top here is actually what they call onsen tamago. So onsen meaning hot spring. These eggs are actually steamed, and you can buy them in a pack of 1. I also received a gift of basically an 18 yolk fan. So here in Australia we have up to 16, but over there they use a bit more paprika. And certainly there was also different colours of eggs. This here shows eggs that are actually marinated, and these eggs have vinegar within them, so that's why they actually don't need to be refrigerated. And the other picture here is of one of the stalls that I visited that had a range of different eggs that you could pick with different, obviously, yolk colours. They had like a yuzu egg that had the hens were fed citrus, and that gave it that yuzu kind of like flavour. I guess there are major differences between the way that Japan looks at its food and safety culture. And people had said to me since, do you think that there's a right way or a wrong way, or, which do you think is better? I mean, really, it's a very different approach. And in Australia, I think we sometimes look at things at a point in time, whereas Japan definitely has a very ongoing approach. And they also have, I guess, a very high internal sharing and mentoring between staff. So one of the restaurants I visited, it was very clear that certainly that the main chef really mentored his staff around raw consumption of egg and around, I guess, food safety. But also, I think too, he himself, as the head chef, had travelled overseas and had looked at systems overseas and had brought back his learnings as well. So again, that shows just that travelling overseas opens your minds, and it kind of sometimes can consolidate, your thinking around particular issues. Very much open kitchens in Japan. And certainly I just found that definitely kind of, not so much checklists, but just the routine that was used really set the scene for, I guess, the way that they work within their system. And then just they're very proud about the use of their eggs. So the restaurant that we were at actually had a sign up that was promoting that the eggs came from the local farm, and that was really great. It's kind of, sometimes you'll see it on a menu, but it's kind of rare to have that in Australia, where the farm's name will kind of be shown. So they're very proud of what they're doing over there. I had the opportunity to visit Tamaru. Tamaru is a farm that has been going for, it was celebrating its 100th year anniversary when I was there. I think that although they're vertically integrated farm, they had a lot of things that were similar to us here in Australia. From the hatchery truck that you can see here, they also have very similar washdown facilities to what we have in Australia. But certainly out the front of head office, two things stood out to me. So one of them was this step-on anti-pathogen tile that they had, which I have seen them available online, but this one was made specifically for their farm. And this tile essentially is a technology to create a semi-permanent disinfectant barrier, and they had this at the entrance of their office and shed before then going through another disinfectant bath. So that was quite different. And then on the other side there, this is actually a memorial to all the hens that have died. So this is very much a cultural, spiritual belief, and helps with emotional recovery and social responsibility. So they had this monument there, to their hens as well. So in my report, I have included this picture, which is from Akagi-san's farm at Fusion Eggs. He was the farmer I was talking to you about before that actually had been impacted by H5 previously, but then looked at the way that he could, I guess, consider improvements in his farm. He also spoke about the fact of in constructing farm, he was looking at wind direction of the particular region and the location of where he would put his farm. So this model was where he had cage birds. He's the only farmer in Japan at a reasonable scale that has free range. So it's 1%. So he is the free range farmer. And the way that his farm was treated, it was approved by the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and that red line down the middle is just a simple fence. It's really about 20 metres between the two facilities, but it was treated as a separate zone. So one of the facilities was the cage facility there actually had H5. He believes that a lot of this was due to the volume of air that was being brought into the actual facility. The free range on the other side wasn't affected at all. Which is quite interesting because we often talk about free range and the view of kind of risk of free range. But the birds in that facility were never positive with the constant testing they were doing, and they managed to save 240,000 birds from that facility. So it was looking at, rather than a farm quarantining, a zoning quarantining system. So I thought that was quite interesting and something that, we very much look at the farm as a whole. I was able to visit Akagi-san's grading floor. This time of year was a special time. It was New Year, so they were doing their mixed packs. So you can see the brown and white eggs there, which they call red and white, which is, I guess a Japanese kind of auspicious thing. Red and white's good. So he was putting those through the grading floor. And before I went there, I was wondering about the biosecurity to go in, but he had basically a whole hallway with glass windows across there so that you could actually walk through and see all the different stages. He also had these wonderful egg signs up, and the local schools come and visit his facility and see what a grading floor is all about. So I thought that was really fantastic that we could see the whole operation. He also had a second floor enclosed glassed area so you could see over the whole grading floor. So that was really quite impressive. One of the simple things on the side here, this lady that was working on the grading floor, is that he has different coloured uniforms every day. And the reason for that is so that if anyone comes from another section into that section, it's very clear that, there's been a biosecurity breach. So I was quite impressed that they have a different coloured uniform for every day of the week, T-shirt and apron. We then went into the liquid egg facility, and I'd not been through this air shower system before, but essentially they had the staff use like a lint roller with the information as to how they should be doing that when they're dressed up. And by removing any dust and other potential contaminants from their clothing, that reduces foreign material or bacteria into the production systems. So I guess it's just a reminder that, biosecurity isn't always about big systems. It's often just about disciplined attention to small details. And so after going through this dressing and lint rolling in your new lab coat, so to speak, then you go through this like this air shower. So I'd not been through one of those before. We often have liquid egg which is in pellets, but they also had these barrels, and they also had the tin, which they said the aluminium tins for quick freezing. They had a range of different sized customers, and had also made a machine that could do various smaller things rather than just bulk liquid egg, and they sold that to a lot of small shops as well. There's a lot of quantity going through in that way. This is the simple welded wire mesh frames that I was talking about that Akagi-san covers with the actual non-woven fabric, and is hung on the side of his sheds. And this one in the middle, I was really interested about this steam bath, and said to him, I had a couple of steam baths around the place, what are these used for? And he said, really, every product that comes out of my factory has gone through that steam bath to make sure that there's no germs or bacteria on the outside of any packet that comes out of my factory. So that was really quite impressive as well. You can see they've got the Cryovac egg rolls there, and various different egg roll products. So look, I hope that really gives a little bit of an overview of some of the different areas that I looked at while I was in Japan. There's still issues that Japan is grappling with around things like vaccine. They were looking at a number of different immunity timeframes around doing that, vaccinating, whether that's useful to do that, when the hen is in production, and any risks around that. So they're still working through a number of issues, just as we are trying to do here in Australia. They did have, in the very early days of H5, a couple that actually took their life, and that was basically because, the difficulty of having H5 and not really understanding, where it had come from and what the situation is. I think that mental health here in Australia has become much more important when there is emergency disease responses, and we kind of now have the details of various organisations that people, their staff can get help from, as well as the owner. I quite often find that owners are very stoic, and they feel that they have to be very strong for their employees, and quite often the load that they're carrying is really substantial, even though they may have financial counsellors and other people around them, and their insurance companies that are trying to help. So I think that that's really an awareness there. So look, I'm very appreciative and must thank the Churchill Trust, and also the Queensland Association of the Churchill Trust, for their support and for their seeing the importance of this topic around management of H5. My employers, Egg Farmers of Australia, and also Doblo's, the Flower Room, our local fruit mart that I work at on a Saturday, who gave me the opportunity to take time off from being here in Australia to go and do this work. I'd also like to thank Candice Dow from QUEP and Sam Allen from Animal Health Australia, who are my referees for this project. And finally, I'd just like to thank my husband, who did a huge amount of translation for me in country, as well as certainly briefs and things that needed to go over prior as well. So look, there was that just gives you a very quick overview, I guess, of my experience and some of the areas. There's a lot more detail in my report, but I hope that that's been helpful for you to think about, on your farm or in your situation, or if you're in a regulating situation, how that sits in what another country is doing at this stage, and what they've done kind of as they continue to progress dealing with H5. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Melinda. That was very insightful. I do have one question before we jump to others, or while they're thinking about what their questions might be. Does Japan do anything or have any issues around reduction in egg consumption and concerns from the public around egg safety when they do have an outbreak, and what kind of communications they do or may not? Is that again left to the farm, or is the government sort of step in more in that regard?
Yeah, look, certainly I asked that question, Beck, when I was there, to both the Japanese Poultry Association and also the equivalent of our RDC, our Research Development Corp over there. And they said that, look, in the very early days, certainly they did have some questions that came through to them, but to be honest, a lot went through to government, and it was government who was answering the queries around that. But because they've really had so many incidences now, the general public is very aware of H5 and what it means. And so as far as communication, I met with the actual poultry news over there and said to them, did they feel that it was their role to be able to put information out to inform, the community? And they said, well, actually, that's something now that the community is very well informed. So, I think that role in communication was very important in the initial stages, and particularly when you had that couple that lost their lives, that now there's more awareness of what it is and how it spreads and that kind of thing. I think certainly that's something that we will need to tackle here a bit more, for people to have an understanding of H5N1, but certainly in Japan the awareness is very high now.
Right, thanks. Has anybody else got any questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. Candice, you might have a question or two.
Thanks, Beck. And thank you for your presentation, Melinda. I think we can all learn a lot about our international colleagues and their experience and approach in dealing with H5, given the significant risk it poses. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, there's obviously different levels of preparedness across the industry in terms of their housing systems, how they operate, and right through to that regulatory landscape where you've got in Australia the federal government, the state agencies, and then even within the agencies, federal and state have food safety and biosecurity as separate arms under different departments. One thing that I wonder sometimes as to whether it gets missed is in that training and workforce capability sphere. It's one thing that has come up in a bit of work I've been doing with you on avian influenza and being prepared, is just about the pipeline of people experienced with it. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts or comments from your observations in Japan on how we might increase that pipeline of vets and people in the supply chain.
Yeah, well, certainly starting with the issue around kind of like the vet side of things, Candice, I met with one vet over there who was purely layers and was an expert in that area and was on most of the HPAI kind of groups there. And he also said to me that, look, we're having exactly the same situation as you've got in Australia. Of course, I explained to him that, many students tend to do, small pets, and, kind of in my area, there's a lot that go to large livestock. But, he really agreed with me around the fact that sometimes it's about having that experience. And look, Australian Eggs has some great materials and things, but I know, I got a request last week to go and speak to my local high school ag group, and look at encouraging them to, spend some time looking at poultry. So I think having that opportunity for vet students to be able to go and do poultry is very important. I think quite often, in speaking with some of the vets when they do have lectures, quite often the lecturer is just running through all the different poultry diseases rather than them talking about, well, what's really great about being a poultry vet. So I think, we as an industry need to do a lot more work in kind of giving that experience. And the vet in Japan also said, sometimes it's very difficult because the experience that the farmers have is so in depth, and to actually start off without having a background in poultry, he said, was quite difficult. So for a number of, vet students that had become poultry vets. So he said having that experience and having that trust from the farmers is really important. You're totally correct in the fact that very much there's centralized ways of doing things in Japan, and we don't have that luxury just because of the differences with the states. But I think we've seen federally how environment and health and agriculture in the last 18 months to 2 years have become very close together in their working. And I'd like to think that, at a state level that's improving as well in that discussion. One of the things, just talking about kind of like, councils and states and things like that, which was of interest to me, was I was wondering why in Japan they weren't incinerating the birds, because we all know that, about 70% of Japan's mountainous and they don't have a lot of land. And I thought, well, is this just something where they're not using incineration because of the throughput and the volume of birds that would be needed to go through? And speaking with one of the mayors, he said to me, well, look, it's really about the fact that we can't have our smoke going over into the next prefecture. So it'd be like saying we can't have the smoke from our birds going over into the next council region. So, something that I thought, well, why is this solution not maybe being considered, came down to essentially their laws and regulation in having, no smoke or anything going to another area outside their own. So that's very kind of Japanese in that way of thinking. So I think, Candice, we as industry bodies have to keep working, both federal and state, to try and close those situations. And I think also farms have been doing a lot in really having that connection with the states. In Japan, I found that particular mayor, when I was speaking to him, he was very clear on the number of farms he had in his area, the number of birds they had. They also provide lime out to their farmers before the season happens as well. So they're very connected even at that kind of local level. And I wondered kind of, if we spoke to some of our councils, maybe whether they'd be so familiar with what their situation would be and the number of kind of hens they have in their area. as well. So yeah, I think certainly there's some strong kind of structures in Japan that maybe we don't have, but we do have, I think, very much industry knowledge, particularly here in Queensland, as to where people are.
Sanders got a question.
Yeah, so the tile, was that because the pathogen trial, was it copper infused or hot, or what was it?
So basically it was looked like a cement tile. Obviously it was an area where it could actually get sun, and it does have a copper ion in it, Tana. So that's correct.
Yeah, no, because I'm going, I need one. I want it. I love the value add too, the products. I mean, I'd love to do more value adding, but that's another level of safe food I'm not wanting to go down.
I think, Tana, like one of the things that was, explained was like in their peak seasons, it's very difficult sometimes for the restaurants to get the staff to be able to produce what they're wanting. So they had a lot of, pre-made, I guess, omelettes and things like that. They still had a lot of products that they did, that were made in-house as well. But it really increased the actual selection that was available to those that were dining there, because they had, the small amount that were being made kind of fresh there, but then they had this whole other
marinated or pickled,
like a lot of eggs that we would say, well, isn't really kind of something that's necessarily on the menu, because it's got that value add product that's available there. Saves less staff, saving time, and they're still able to provide eggs.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. It was awesome.
Amazing. Thanks, Tana. One final question from me, unless anybody else has got anything burning. Melinda, you mentioned at the start of your presentation around the shared responsibility emphasis that they have in Japan. And here in Queensland, we have that concept in our biosecurity legislation, and we have a general biosecurity obligation. But the extension side of it is probably not as strong as it might need to be. So I was just wondering if there is any specific kind of learnings or observations that you'd made around maybe even how other states in Australia might be doing that better, or how we could learn from Japan in terms of engaging more, smaller producers or even backyard just keepers of chooks in that sort of more shared responsibility and awareness space.
Yeah, look, I think certainly anyone that's involved, like in the industry, really is an advocate for the industry when they're talking about, particularly biosecurity and the levels that we need. The other areas too is, I remember going and visiting my local fanciers club, and also, like a lot of the pigeon racing clubs, they've got high biosecurity in what they do as well. That was another area that kind of I looked into. So we've kind of got these different groups that, are at different levels, but I think we're all advocates in that way. And I think trying to work together is very important. I think too, there's been a lot of material that's been provided for backyard. So there's multiple websites you can go to, and I know that a number of states are updating their information as well. I think, to be honest, again, we may say in a lot of ways that we're a small industry when we look at the number of farms, but across all of those staff on those farms, they're also people that know about the egg industry too. And that was one of the things, I guess, that I found in Japan was, I guess they've got a much larger industry, but I looked at the Japan Poultry Association board, they had 23 board directors, I've got 5. So you think about like just the volume of people that are involved in the industry to get the messaging out. So I think that's something that, we as a poultry industry can do. I think ACT, that example I gave where they had particular postcodes where they asked people to register, that was very successful. And that has been a catalyst for poultry posts. So we just keep trying to advocate for that work. Candice, was our HPAI engagement officer for 12 months. So Candice has just finished her final milestone report. And one of the things there was a focus on looking at, I guess, the different projects that have been where the federal government has funded HPAI projects, and that will allow us to follow along and see progress in that area. So for those here, I just want you to be aware of that work, because DAF will publish Candice's last report, which is basically a summary of all the work that Candice did across the 4 reports. And I think that that will be very important, not only for people in backyard that maybe are not so connected into what's happening, but I think also for the department, where we sometimes have people that come in that don't have a poultry background, and they'll be able to pick up the report. The idea was it would be a foundation report to learn more about our industry. So I think, it's not only the community that we're working with, it's also working with, our departmental officers, advisors, and even through to ministers when we do briefings with them to understand more about our industry.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, unless anybody else has any other questions, we might let everybody get back to their afternoon. I'm sure people have kids to pick up and things to finish off for the day. But thank you again, Melinda, for sharing your insights with us today. It's been really great. If anybody has any particular topics around the poultry industry and building resilience that they would like to see as part of the Farm Business Resilience Program, please reach out to myself or to Candice or to Melinda. We're really keen to hear from people around what they would like to see. So if you've got any burning topics that you'd like to see, happy to try and facilitate that over the next sort of 12 months or couple of years. So yeah, I'll let everybody else get back to their day. Thanks again, Melinda. Thanks, Candice. And have a great afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Melinda.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.